I'm privileged today to have Dr. Noam Chomsky on the line. Noam Chomsky is an author. He's an institute professor emeritus at MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where he taught for over half a century. Among his many dozens of books are Rogue States, The Rule of Force in World Affairs, The New Military Humanism, Lessons from Kosovo, Fateful Triangle, The United States, Israel and Palestinians, Manufacturing Consent, Necessary Illusions, Thought Control in Democratic Societies, and Failed States, The Abuse of Power and the Assault on Democracy. Dr. Chomsky, thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to Latin Waves.
Very glad to be with you.
Many people are now talking about the economic crisis, but for people in Latin America, they would argue that we have been in crisis for a long time. What do you see as the root causes of this crisis?
Well, they're correct. I mean, first of all, there is no the economic crisis. There's a lot of economic crises, and the most serious of them, in human terms, are not even being discussed. So the worst economic crisis right now is the food crisis. I mean, there's a billion people in the world who don't have food to eat, and a couple of billion who have very limited food to eat. I mean, even in a rich country like the United States, there's maybe 35 million or more who go to bed hungry every night. Now, that's a huge problem, far worse than the financial crisis of the banks. And it's not talked about in the West because it's the poor who are suffering. It's talked about elsewhere. So I read not long ago an article in a journal from Bangladesh which pointed out this disparity and also made the important point that the West is putting trillions of dollars into fixing up its banks, but they're not even spending a fraction of the small amount that they promised for dealing with a billion people starving. So which is the crisis, And that generalizes. I mean, it's true that Latin America has been in crisis since the 1980s. During the 70s, Latin America had a pretty high growth rate in the 50s and the 60s under the program of import substitution, just sort of developing your own economy, not importing. And they even had the support of the World Bank for it at that time, and it grew pretty fast, high growth rates. The neoliberal period came along in the late 1970s, early 1980s, and since then it's just been a disaster. Actually, it's been picking up a little in the last, during this century, the last couple of years, as the neoliberal rules have been dismantled and dismissed. People aren't following them as closely. But yes, it's been an enormous crisis. And in fact, even take the United States, again, richest country in the world, for the majority of the population in the United States, the crisis has been going on for about 30 years, also the neoliberal period. So for a majority of the population, real wages in the United States have stagnated, sometimes declined, for about 30 years. Meanwhile, benefits have declined, working hours have gone up. If people have survived by going deeply into debt, having two members of the family trying to work, and so on. Well, that's a real economic crisis, but it isn't called that because it didn't hit the rich people. Now, the current crisis is hitting everywhere, so the rich are suffering, and they're therefore taking measures to deal with it, and it's quite striking that the measures that the rich countries are using for themselves are the opposite of the ones that the IMF and the Treasury Department ordered the poor countries to take. So, when Indonesia had a crisis 10 years ago, the instructions from the World Bank were raise interest rates, slow down the economy, pay your debts to us, privatize everything. Just the opposite of what's being done to ourselves. Forget about inflation, pour money into rescuing the banks, some into a stimulus. Don't worry about the debts. Let them get as large as you like, and take over institutions that aren't working. The government takeover. Exactly the opposite proposals. There's one set of rules for the weak, and there's another set of rules for the strong. Actually, that goes back as far as you like. The difference between the first, we call the North and the South, first and third world, that actually pretty much goes back to about the 18th century. The differences weren't very great then. In fact, in the 18th century, the centers of production, commerce, industry, better health systems, trades, marketing, and so on were in the East. It was India and China. The currently rich countries were kind of a fringe. It changed primarily because one major factor in the divergence is that the rich countries like England, they developed by means that are now called piracy, literally, and by a heavy state-directed economy. While having conquered India, they imposed on India neoliberal principles. So yes, India declined, Britain grew. It's not unlike what's been happening here with regard to Latin America. In fact, Latin America and East Asia are an interesting comparison in the last 30 years. Latin America is the region of the world that most rigorously followed the neoliberal rules of the International Monetary Fund and the U.S. Treasury Department, which are about the same. And it, it was a lost couple of decades. East Asia ignored the rules. In fact, used methods pretty much like those of the industrial societies themselves when they were becoming rich and developed, and it prospered.
I just want to comment that these policies of neoliberalism that you describe have really run rampant in Latin America, and it's almost expected that the South will be impoverished. But here in Canada, by American standards, a lot of friends will tell me I live in a socialist country because we have a healthcare system. But yet, as of 1980, there was similar policies introduced in Canada, where the government, the federal government, decided to impose an interest rate of 20 and 22% that completely devastated the country and led us into a serious recession. From then on, the cutbacks started to come in. By 1994, the federal government, under the Liberal government, which is not a conservative government, we have three parties in Canada, said they needed to tighten the belts, and so they cut back in services. They really set us back in terms of progressive policies on housing, shelter, education. All of those things were cut. Now, no one mentioned that the total amount that we were spending on public services was about 5%. So all this talk about tightening our belt, that's not where we're spending our money. I wonder if you could comment, what is the root of these policies then? Because it seems that the policies of creating housing, creating funding education or healthcare seem to be tied to a different set of guidelines. It's not the public anymore that's guiding those initiatives. So where are these orders coming from, and who is in charge if we're not?
Well, first of all, what you described about Canada is also largely true of the United States. So the Reagan administration, Paul Volker, who's the Treasury Secretary and is now one of Obama's advisors, he drove the United States into a deep recession in the early 1980s. The Reagan years was the worst recession since the Great Depression. And after that, there was some growth, but very inegalitarian growth. It was not like the 50s and the 60s when there was a much higher growth rate, and it was also egalitarian, so the poor did about as well as the rich. Since the early 80s, after the Volker recession, which also really devastated Latin America, because what he did was raise interest rates very high, and rates on Latin American debts were tied to the U.S. interest rate. So it was a devastating effect on Latin America. In fact, Mexico was the first to suffer. They essentially went bankrupt in 1982, and then other countries followed. And since then, there has also been the same decline in public services, public funding, and so on in the United States, while wealth accumulated in a very small number of pockets. I mean, the inequality now is just incredible, much worse than it was before. Now, there is a difference between Canada and the United States. They're similar societies, but the United States is more of a business-run society. Canada has stronger unions, has a stronger social democratic background, and there was more resistance to these developments in Canada than the United States. You mentioned the national healthcare system. Well, the United States doesn't have it, has it partially for the elderly, But it's the one industrial country that doesn't have such a system, and it's a disaster. Healthcare costs are about twice as high per capita as other industrial societies, and the health outcomes are among the worst in the industrial world. So the tendencies are the same, but they're functioning a little differently depending on the societies, and Latin America was hit the worst. But what you're describing is essentially the course that was taken over the last 30 years by quite a large number of countries, not all. So East Asian countries, China, they didn't follow these rules, and they've been doing, growing. Even India, India was not hit very hard by the current financial crisis, but that's because they had kept their financial system more isolated from the global financial system than the others. They hadn't followed the neoliberal rules to this extent. In fact, there's a very striking correlation between the extent to which those rules were followed and the extent of the harm to the general population. Now, who's running it all? Certainly not the populations. I mean, take the United States. A large majority of the population for decades have wanted to have a Canadian-style healthcare system. There's no secret about it, and polls have been showing it for 40 years. But they can't get it because there's just too much power in the hands of the insurance companies, the financial institutions, the pharmaceutical corporations, and so on. And they write the laws. I mean, it's happening right now. It was recently discovered that the Obama administration's proposals about how to bolster the banks, pour public money into the banks, were written actually directly written by the law firms that work for the banks, handed it to the Treasury Department, and they put it into the law. I mean, that's a particularly blatant example. Usually they cover their tracks a little better, but essentially that's the way it works. I mean, it's not a radical critique. The economist at MIT is former chief economist of the IMF. He's by no means a radical. He's written scathing criticisms of the Obama administration because they're just putting the White House into the pocket of Wall Street and following policies which will design to sustain the system of privilege and power that got us into this crisis. That's their main goal. Now, there's a manufacturing crisis in the United States, which is more important for the population than the financial crisis, but they're being treated very differently. They don't get money poured into them the way the banks do. So, yes, the financial institutions are extremely powerful. If you go back, say, 30, 40 years, they were a small part of the economy. Now they're probably a third or 40% of the corporate profits are just coming from financial institutions, which don't produce anything. They're basically speculative institutions.
So how do you explain this Obama phenomenon? He ran in an anti-Bush platform for change, and there was a lot of media coverage of how he truly mobilized the masses and created significant change. What indication do we have that he is truly different and that there will be any change? Are there any fundamental changes to domestic or foreign policies that are contrary to the Bush administration?
What happened was actually well described by the advertising industry. In the United States, political campaigns are basically run by the public relations industry. And as they say themselves, they market candidates pretty much the same way they market toothpaste or lifestyle drugs. They give an award every year. The journal Advertising Age, main journal, gives an award every year to the best marketing campaign of the year. Well, in 2008, they gave it to the Obama campaign. They said that was the best marketing campaign we run. We've been marketing candidates since Reagan, and this is the best we've ever done. It's going to change the atmosphere in corporate boardrooms, all the techniques we developed. So, yes, it was a successful advertising campaign. As you say, it focused on change, but any advertising executive would know that that's what you focus on. They read polls. They know that 80% of the population was deeply disturbed that the country's going in the wrong direction. So, of course, your campaign heralds hope and change. In fact, the Keynes did it too. except they weren't as effective. The financial institutions, which are the mainly power the political campaigns, they preferred Obama to McCain, so they poured a lot more money into Obama's campaign, and it showed up in the slight electoral differences, and they got their man through. So it's not a surprise that he's working for the financial industries now. If you check back and ask, what are we hoping for? What's the change going to be? There's almost nothing about that in the campaign. It's just, we'll change things. We can hope for the future, And that did galvanize and energize a lot of people. Also, there's the fact that he's an African American. Now, that's significant. If you go back, say, 40 years, or for that matter, 10 years, the idea that the Democrats would be running two candidates, an African American and a woman, that would have been almost inconceivable. And in fact, that's a tribute. Nobody wants to say it, but that's a tribute to the activism of the 1960s. The student activists and young people who were, changing things in the 1960s, their activities really had a civilizing effect on the country. It's been expanding ever since. And it got to the point where what was unimaginable then took place now. And that shows, incidentally, how things can happen. But Obama himself, you can't really criticize him for deceit. He never claimed anything. He just said, I'm for hope and change. What? No, left that open. He presented himself as kind of a blank slate. You can write your hopes and dreams on it. And that's the way the advertising campaign was run. And it was successful. And it's not just in Canada. In Europe, even in the Middle East, everywhere, there's a sense that something wonderful is going to happen without any basis whatsoever. When you get to his policies, I think they're exactly what should have been anticipated from the candidate of the financial industry. I mean, he started to pull back from some of the most extreme Bush administration's departures from the norm. The Bush administration was kind of off the spectrum in terms of its reactionary jingoism and extremism and contempt for others and so on. That's why the prestige of the United States sank to historic lows. And Obama is moving back toward the center. So some of the more extreme Bush directives he withdrew. He made a few gestures in favor of what people really want, do something about global warming and so on. But the main policies are, not changed very much. I mean, take, say, healthcare, which we were talking about. As I mentioned, the majority of the population for decades has favored a Canadian-style system, kind of Medicare plus, sometimes called. Well, the insurance industries and the financial institutions and the pharmaceutical institutions are bitterly opposed to that. They don't want it extended to the whole. They don't want that to be an option, and they're pretty frank about it. They say we can't compete with an efficient government program, and therefore it's unfair to us to allow that to be an option. And that's presented with a straight face by people who say they're in favor of a free market. They're doing everything they can think of, even making crazy promises that they're never going to keep in order to drive that option off the table. And the Obama administration is accepting that. They're not pushing for anything. It's pretty much the same on other issues. On international affairs, it's not the more extreme of the Bush policies, but it's essentially an extension of Bush policies. I mean, the main military effort is in what they're now calling AFPAC, Afghanistan and Pakistan, and that's continuing the escalation of the military component of the intervention, which Bush began to escalate in 2004, and Obama's escalating it even farther. In regard to Latin America, there's essentially almost nothing. I mean, there's a lot of talk about his great gesture to Cuba. I mean, what was the gesture to Cuba? Bush introduced a very extremist position, which was opposed even by the Cuban-American community here. It was so extreme on constraints on, sending money, visiting relatives, and so on. And Obama pulled back from that. He's not saying anything about the embargo, which has been crushing Cuba for ever since the Kennedy years, and which the American population strongly opposes. Large majority have always opposed it. Nothing about that. In fact, basically nothing, except pulling back from the more extreme of Bush's positions and changing the rhetoric. So instead of being arrogant and contemptuous, he sounds pleasant, says, we love you, and so on. But he never promised anything else, so one shouldn't be surprised.
While the U.S. has been busy with Iraq and Afghanistan, progressive movements in Latin America are taking this opportunity to advance their movements and electing responsive leaders willing to challenge the policies of neoliberalism and introduce policies that address the local issues of hunger, shelter, health, and education. In Latin America, most notably, we've seen Venezuela under Hugo Chavez and Bolivia with Evo Morales, and introducing policies like nationalizing their banks, taking over factories. What do you see cultural change that needs to happen for us in the North to develop our own way of counteracting the policies of neoliberalism that are also destroying our communities?
Yeah, well, I think what you're describing is, in my opinion, at least one of the maybe the most exciting development in world affairs in recent years. First time since the Spanish and Portuguese conquests. Latin America is beginning to address some of the really deep problems of the society. One of these problems is the grotesque inequality. In Latin America has been plagued by the fact that its wealthy classes, very small minority, have essentially shown no responsibility for the societies. I mean, they don't pay their taxes, they ship capital abroad, they have their second homes in the Riviera, and so on and so forth. Well, there's some effort now being made to overcome the steep, profound inequality and oppression that flows from it in Latin America. Also, the Latin American countries have been separated from one another. That's, again, a residue of the conquest. And they're finally beginning to move towards some sort of integration. And integration is a prerequisite for independence. There's a lot of talk about how Bush neglected Latin America. It's probably the best thing that happened to Latin America. They didn't have much interference from the United States during those years. So they were able to pursue developments which were indigenous. They came from inside. A lot of it came from mass popular movements, a lot of it resistance to neoliberalism, which is going on for years. I mean, the MST in Brazil, for example, is back to the 80s. The indigenous movement in Bolivia has been active for years, again, in reaction to the neoliberal disasters of the 80s. And, there has been significant progress. And the U.S. is, of course, opposing it. I mean, that's to be expected. To take a concrete example, Bolivia, which in my opinion is probably the most democratic country in the world right now, where the indigenous population, the majority, the most repressed population in the hemisphere, entered the political arena and elected someone from their own ranks. I mean, that doesn't happen in rich countries. Someone who follows policies that are developed by the population, important issues like control over resources and cultural rights and so on. And it wasn't just election day. These are matters that they've been struggling about for years. I mean, the water wars a couple of years ago are an example, but plenty more. Well, that's real functioning democracy. Now, the traditional elites are, of course, strongly opposed to it. Mostly white, rich elites in the eastern area, and they want to move towards some kind of autonomy or maybe even secession. There was, last September, there was violence. A lot of pro-Morales peasant groups, a couple of dozen were killed, and the issue became a major issue for a while. And there was a meeting of the new Union of South American Republics, UNASUR, recently formed, includes all the republics of South America, even Colombia. They had a meeting about this in Santiago, Chile, where they came out with a strong declaration supporting Morales and criticizing the violence and the activities of the traditional elites. Morales responded with an important statement. He said he thanked them for their support, and he said correctly that this is the first time in 500 years that Latin America is beginning to take its fate into its own hands without the interference of outsiders. Last century or two, that's been the United States. Well, that was really important. In fact, a mark of its importance is that it was not reported in the United States, literally. I don't know about Canada. It was very significant, and it is a sign of developments that are taking place. Right now, the United States is being compelled to support governments that 40 years ago it would have overthrown, like Lula's government in Brazil, which is now the favorite. It's following policies that were not all that different from the Goulart government where the Kennedy administration organized a military coup carried out shortly after the assassination. But the traditional methods of control that the U.S. had don't operate well anymore. One of them is just violence. I mean, the last time in this century, the U.S. has tried twice to support essentially a military coup in Latin America. Once was in Venezuela in 2002, and that was beaten back immediately. And the other was in Haiti, along with France and with Canadian support, where they essentially kidnapped the president and threw him out of the hemisphere, forced to stay in Africa. That succeeded, but Haiti's a very weak state. But basically they cannot resort to violence as they could in the past. They've been thrown out of military bases, like in Ecuador. The other weapon was economic strangulation, economic warfare, but that's been weakened too. Many of the countries in South America have thrown out the IMF. In fact, the IMF was in serious trouble. It wasn't getting funding to maintain its operations because countries paid off, either restructured or paid off their debts. Argentina, Brazil, Bolivia, with Venezuelan assistance and so on. And all of that is liberating, gives opportunities. There are plenty of problems, huge problems, but there are opportunities. Incidentally, with regard to Bolivia, it's been known that the U.S. has been putting quite a lot of what's called aid into Bolivia, U.S. aid, but the government had kept it secret. A lot of people had inquired to find out what is the aid, but the government wouldn't tell them. However, some material just came out under the Freedom of Information Act, and as people expected, critics expected, the aid to Bolivia is going to the opposition groups, to the traditional elite, the anti-Morales opposition, the anti-democratic forces. So that's what you'd expect. But the U.S. used to do that on a much grander scale. Now, so far, Obama hasn't said anything relevant, and maybe the policy will slightly change, but there's no indication of it.
What keeps you going? What kindles your hope that a better world is possible and that we can create a world with justice founded on principles of sharing and egalitarian values?
Basically, two reasons. One of them is just plain fact. I mean, if we look back over history, even recent history, there's been a fair amount of progress. It's not that the world is so wonderful. It isn't. And there's a lot of regression, too. But overall, there's a general progress. I mentioned one example. The United States has become a much more civilized society since the 1960s as a result of activism, dedicated, long-term activism. One sign of that is, the candidates in the last election. I don't happen to like them, but nevertheless, as I said, that's inconceivable 40 years ago. But there's many other examples. So slowly, over time, popular struggles do have an effect, even though there is regular regression. And that goes way back. The other reason is just kind of almost a point of logic. We have only two options. We can give up hope and make sure that the worst is going to happen, or we can maintain hope and act accordingly, and maybe things will get better. I mean, when those are your options, you don't have a serious choice.
Thank you so much for joining us. My guest is Dr. Noam Chomsky, and we thank you so much for joining us. Take care.
Yeah, very
Bye-bye.
glad to be with you. Yeah, bye.
You are listening to Latin Waves, a weekly syndicated program. For more information about our program, visit www.latinwavesmedia.com.